Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we will be recapping our reviews for the month of August 2023. This video will feature three things: a discussion of our favorite coffee this month, as well as any honorable mentions, our upcoming coffee of the month, and anything else pertaining to this channel that we feel is worth discussing or addressing. And that includes an upcoming video series, as well as an update on our grinder, so stay tuned for both of those. But let's go ahead and get started with our honorable mentions. And as always, these are in order of when we reviewed them on this channel. And first up, we have the SOS Batyan CCX, a coffee cherry center processed Kenya from Coffea Circular out of Arendal, Norway. And as I mentioned in that review, Coffea Circular's Kenyan separation project is one of the most important projects in coffee for me. And we have reviewed some of those coffees in the past, including the Ruby Batyan, one of my favorite Kenyan coffees that we've ever reviewed on this channel. So when I had an opportunity to review another one of these coffees, I actually had a pretty good idea of what I might be expecting going into it, knowing full well that there are some very vibrant and out there coffees, and this one was definitely no exception. One of the other things I mentioned in that review is that this was a very enjoyable, unique, and different coffee, especially for what you might expect from a Kenyan coffee. But with that being said, it's not a coffee that I would enjoy drinking every single day, as it was pretty wild, intense, and out there altogether. But credit to Coffea Circular. As some people know, they're going to be featured a lot more in the upcoming month, as they were featured in our most recent Applying to Taste Test ranking video. So definitely stay tuned for more of them. All right, next up we have the Shea 22056, a wash processed Ethiopia from Mood Trap out of Singapore. And this was Mood Trap's first ever appearance on this channel, and I was definitely blown away by this coffee, as this coffee offered a lot more Panamanian geisha-like cup than I might have expected going into it. And I'd heard some things about this coffee roaster, but I honestly wanted to try for myself, and this obviously wasn't my main reason for purchasing from them, but it was a really nice surprise, as I haven't necessarily had the best experience with Ethiopian geishas in general. So trying this one right here and having it come out very clean, vibrant, sweet, floral, and fruity all in one in such a well-defined manner was really an indictment on just how good this coffee roaster is. I was really impressed by this one, and that's saying a lot given that this wasn't even my favorite coffee that we've reviewed from them this month. Massive credits to Mood Trap on this one. I'm definitely looking forward to trying more of their coffees in the future. All right, next up we have the Finca Soledad, the anaerobic washed processed Ecuador from Rose Coffee Roasters out of Zurich, Switzerland. And if you watched this review, then you saw that I was actually slightly underwhelmed by this coffee, but even with that, it was actually one of the more enjoyable coffees that I reviewed this month. The only reason I might have been slightly underwhelmed by this one was because I went into it with such extremely high expectations, given I'd had some extremely good results from this coffee roaster, and obviously Pepe Hijón. The Finca Soledad coffees are some of my favorite coffees over the course of the last year, so the combination of those two things led to some borderline unattainable expectations for this coffee. But even then, the only reason I didn't necessarily enjoy this coffee as much as I had expected was that I had anticipated a much more sweet and vibrant cup, whereas this one did offer a lot of the characteristics I've experienced from Pepe Hijón's coffees, including that Mejorado-like aspect. And in addition to that, it did have some great clarity as well as some nice fruit components to it. So on paper, this is one of those coffees that if most coffee roasters had served me this, I would have been thoroughly impressed by it, and I was really enjoying this one, but I think the only thing that held this one back was some astronomical expectations. Even with that, it offered a lot of my favorite things from coffee in general, so credits to Rose on this one. Even if it didn't live up to the expectations, I would still say that this was a well above average coffee for me. And that leads to my favorite coffee this month, and for anybody that watches all of our reviews, this won't come as a surprise to you. It is the Morona Zamora, the wash processed Ecuador from Mood Trap, also out of Singapore. And this was my main reason for purchasing from Mood Trap in the first place, as this coffee was brought to my attention and it caught my interest for a number of reasons. Obviously, the biggest being that it was another Típica Mejorado coffee. And as I mentioned with the Finca Soledad coffee, those have been my favorite coffees to review over the course of the last year. In addition to that, I don't have any familiarity with this producer, but any opportunity I get to review that variety is one that I definitely want to take. And this one right here, right from the first cup, I could tell was something special, as it offered one of the sweetest cups we have ever reviewed on this channel. This one gave me shades of the Pepe Hijón, the Tioxidate or wash processed Ecuador from Manhattan last year, which was my favorite coffee from the entirety of last year and one of my favorite coffees that I've ever reviewed on this channel. This one's on par with that, as this is one of my favorite coffees that I've ever reviewed on this channel. Easily my favorite coffee that I've ever had this year, and it's for two very big and distinct reasons. One, it had tremendous sweetness, something I described as having maybe level 6 or even higher sweetness, as this was an incredibly sweet cup. It offered so many of those Típica Mejorado aspects to it, that brown candied sweetness. In addition to that, it did offer some more depth and complexity, as so many of the factors within this one were very sweet and defined. So this one right here was the one that really seemed to set Mooch Trap apart for me, and the one that impressed me the most, at least as of this point this year. So once again, massive credit to Mooch Trap on this one. All right, and that leads us to our upcoming coffee of the month, and it is another Shea 22 056 wash processed Ethiopian Gesha. This one is from Junto out of Taylor, South Carolina. Of course, it won our coffee of the month poll, beating out 3 other coffees that were directly suggested to us. And this is kind of a perfect opportunity to discuss that, as right here I actually have one of the other coffees that was suggested to us, which is that Dayglow coffee. It was the CO2, the honey processed Colombian coffee. And I did want to talk directly to you guys about this one because I found out that Dayglow uses actually Lil Wolf. So Lil Wolf is their roaster. So it's basically them just kind of under the guise of Dayglow. So I don't know if it's necessarily worth putting on our suggestions recommendations list. I have put it on our suggestions recommendations list. If you guys don't know, I include that list in all of our monthly update videos. So go ahead and check that down below. I also want you guys to let me know if there's a coffee roaster I've missed, because we do get a lot of suggestions and recommendations, and oftentimes it can be a little difficult to keep up, as I don't update that list every single day or every single time I get them, because sometimes it's not feasible to do so. So sometimes I do miss one, and I noticed recently that I missed one. So I'm hoping that this list is up to date. Let me know if there's anything that I'm missing from this list. But yes, this one right here is that Dayglow coffee. So I put Dayglow on the list. I put a question mark on there because I'm not sure if we should still review them or if they're worth reviewing, given that they're essentially just Lil Wolf. This right here is an opportunity for me to at least try the coffee that was possibly going to be one of our coffee of the months. So let's go ahead and give it a quick shot. And I think the biggest thing I was looking for in this one was to see what sort of clarity we were getting, and it's not bad. The clarity on it is actually, you can definitely tell that it's not quite a wash processed coffee, and it does have a little bit more sweetness in general. The citric component to it is definitely present. It's on the forefront. There is a slight fermenty aspect to it, so I think it's fine. This one probably wouldn't have been my favorite coffee to review, but that kind of takes us back to this coffee that we do have right here, which is the one from Junto. So let's talk about this one, because this is our coffee of the month. And this coffee, honestly, it probably wasn't going to be one that I ever would have reviewed on my own, even if it is compared directly alongside the one we'd had from Mooch Trap, one of my favorite coffees this year. The main reason for that is I haven't necessarily had the best experiences with Junto in the past, and I've definitely heard some extremely mixed reviews on this coffee. But even then, I've always said before that it's worth comparing coffee roasters side by side with the same coffee. So that, at least in its own sense, is interesting that this is the same coffee that we had previously reviewed from another roaster. So I think that will at the very least make for an interesting review. I tried my first cup of it today, actually, and it wasn't quite to the extent of that Mooch Trap coffee, but we'll definitely see how it turns out by the end. So stay tuned for that. All right, now 2 really big pieces of news, and this actually does kind of work with the suggestions that we've been talking about, and it's some pretty big news. I am actually going to be recording a video series in Japan coming up here, so there are a lot of things I wanted to tell you about and a lot of things I wanted to ask you for as well. And the first thing I wanted to tell you about was this is the reason why I've held back on taking any sort of recommendations or suggestions from people, because I'm going to be gone by the time any of these coffees would arrive. So I'm hoping that a lot of the suggestions you guys have given to me will still be available for purchase by the time I do get back. But for the time being, I've put a temporary pause on the coffees that I am going to be purchasing as part of recommendations to work on this upcoming trip that we do have. And some coffees I really wanted to highlight that I have put a temporary pause on include the Juan Peña Típica Mejorado coffee from September, because I really want to try that coffee. So I do hope that Kyle might still have some of that left by the time I am back. And then in addition to that, it's those Savage coffees from the Picky Chemist, because I'm sure a lot of people really want me to review those coffees. I did have some people reach out to me when those coffees actually were released, asking if I was going to be reviewing them. And I've actually reached out to the Picky Chemist myself to kind of get an idea on when those coffees might still be around to see if we have a chance to review them. So those could possibly happen, but it's just going to be a matter of how many people actually purchase them. In addition to that, a number of suggestions that I've had to say, we'll see what happens. We'll see if I get back and can make those reviews work. But the second part of that is I was actually going to ask you guys which coffee shops in Japan you wanted to see us review, because I mean, we're going to be doing an entire video series out there, and I haven't started compiling a list yet. The only coffee roaster I do know that I'm going to be visiting for sure, or the coffee shop I'm going to be visiting for sure, sorry about the sirens in the background, is the Switch Coffee, because that was my favorite coffee shop that I had visited last time I was out in Japan. So I'm going to go back to that one for sure, but outside of that, I don't necessarily have one that I'm going to be going to for sure. This will be just kind of a starting point. I've also received some recommendations from some people that also live in Japan, so hopefully these things will kind of balance out. All right, sirens seem to have stopped for now. Let's continue on. So let me know which coffee shops you do want us to do reviews for. And that does lead into our final discussion, and that is the discussion on our grinder. So I'm going to give a very shortened background story about the current grinder that we use, because we get asked this question probably most frequently out of any question that we do get asked. And it's just a very modest Virtuoso Plus. And there's a very simple explanation for why we have this grinder, and it's because a lot of people like myself have been drinking coffee for a very long time, making their own coffee. I mean, it's been well over 10 years at this point that I've been making my own coffee, and like most people, I started out with a terrible grinder. I also had a blade grinder, and after it broke after just a couple of months, I decided, okay, let's get something a little better. And the first coffee grinder I do remember getting was just a very modest Baratza Encore. And I worked with that for a little bit before I found out that I needed to upgrade that. And the next upgrade to it was the Virtuoso Plus. And that's the coffee grinder we started with when we started this channel, because back in the day, believe it or not, coffee grinders weren't quite as big as they are now. So I hadn't heard as much about them as you do these days. And that had really good results with Baratza. And in addition to that, I had so much familiarity with this grinder. But a lot of this became a little bit of a sticking point back in 2020, because I had highly anticipated the release of the Ode, which I know a lot of people were anticipating as well. But when I found out about all the negative feedback from that grinder, I decided to hold off and wait for them to re-release that grinder. And then after that, I actually happened to have some of my own issues with some of Fellows products, including the Stag Kettle, which stopped working for me, and some of their other products, which I haven't necessarily been the biggest fan of. So I said, okay, I'm going to put this on the back burner for right now. I'm just going to kind of wait to see what happens with the grinder situation. And that's when I began working with somebody on this, and that's Jonathan. So I wanted to give a shout out to Jonathan, one of our subscribers, because we've been working on potential grinders for a bit. And essentially my thoughts were, since the Ode didn't really turn out how I had expected or hoped it would, then I was going to wait until we could get an ultimate endgame grinder, so something like a P100, an EG1, an EK43, something along those lines. But after a little bit more consideration and after talking with Jonathan a little bit, I came to the conclusion that maybe having that sort of high-end, the highest end sort of grinder, isn't necessarily ideal for the type of people that watch this content. And after some further discussions, we decided that since the Ode, it's probably the most utilized grinder from a lot of our viewers, uses a 64 millimeter burst set, then probably going to be a really good idea to use a 64 millimeter burst set grinder. And that's when we came to the conclusion of going with the DF64 with the SSP 64 millimeter multi-purpose spurs. And that in itself should provide one of the more clean cups of coffee, especially that we can get with that sort of burst set. And I feel like it's going to be comparable to a lot of what other people use in terms of grinders as well. So this was kind of middle ground, because I really did want to get something extremely high end, but I said it's not going to be a really relatable grinder for a lot of the people that do watch this content. But if we do go with something a little bit more modest that's also still high end and offers a similar burst set to what a lot of other people use, then that might be ideal. So I'm very curious to hear your guys' feedback on that. What do you think it's going to be? Just for very precise definition, the DF64 version 2, and it's going to be the SSP multi-purpose 64 millimeter burst set. So if that's a good idea, let me know. I'm actually very curious to hear your guys' feedback as well. Jonathan is a very big coffee equipment guy, and this is kind of what we've come to as maybe the ideal solution, the kind of ideal middle ground for between something that we're currently using as well as something that I was hoping to use. I feel like this might be the best fit for what you guys are using as well. And a lot of it comes because I'm probably not going to be getting the Ode. It just doesn't necessarily seem like my type of grinder. But yeah, that's a lot. I've been telling you guys a lot. There's been a lot of updates. There's been a lot of news. So give me all of your feedback on that. Coffee shops to visit in Japan, our suggestions, recommendations list, as well as our feedback on the grinder as well. Just let me know. But I'm going to leave this video at that. As I always say, if you guys enjoyed the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a recap of our coffees from the month of August 2023. Thank you for watching.